Let's reveal the answer key, your case study, answer key, a key to a better understanding of the GTR method is here. A key to a better understanding of the GTR method is here. Hello, welcome to your GTR answer key. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the case study Jeannie has letters to write. I wanted to include this particular case study into your GTR training for several reasons. Number one, it is a good example of how to use the therapeutic letter with your client. And number two, Jeannie is the kind of client who definitely has some more complex trauma. And on top of that complex trauma from the past, there's a lot of acute stress going on in her present. Jeannie is the type of client who got a bit stuck trying to figure herself out. And this is also because she has been trying to figure out where she's at with her life on top of the trauma piece. Jeannie has been trying to get help, but unfortunately, she, number one, never found a good practitioner to work with. And number two, she never realized that what she has been really struggling with a lot of the time was actually trauma. Before this session, we learned that Jeannie started to connect with her anger. And this is a major sign of progress because getting access to her anger means that she's finally melting her freeze response. But Jeannie's anger is interspersed with tears and crying. And this tells us that there is grief as well, and that grief needs to be processed. This is exactly what I focus on with Jeannie in this 5th GTR session called Jeannie Has Letters to Write. In this session, we take the first step in the grief processing direction. Interrelationship trauma is often marked by the presence of the so-called double binds, or these are sometimes known as the damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. These represent the inescapability part of the trauma equation. For example, in this session, we learned that Jeannie's mother would measure Jeannie all the time and deem her waist size either acceptable or not, usually not. However, she simultaneously expected Jeannie to have a voluptuous backside and berated her if it got smaller. Essentially, her standards were contradictory and impossible to meet. Jeannie could literally never measure up. The threat, which was losing the emotional bond with her mother and being emotionally abandoned by her, was inescapable. This also has an effect on Jeannie's ability, or rather inability, to complete one of the most basic developmental tasks of adulthood, which is to sustain and nourish herself through food or otherwise. Jeannie's belief that she can't sustain herself is a logical consequence of this upbringing. She never learned how to properly nourish herself on a physical level. Food was an enemy that could cause her to lose her mother's approval, and that she had to control so carefully that it wasn't a source of comfort or sustenance for her. Let's talk a little bit about giving the client permission to respond from a not yet healed part of themselves. This session provided a very helpful distinction to make with clients between the different ways that anger can manifest. When describing the letter writing assignment, I tried to make sure to clarify that these letters are to allow Jeannie to express the grief and anger that a younger part of herself is still carrying. Jeannie has an inner child with an unaddressed need or unaddressed needs and emotions. And this is who needs to have her voice heard through writing the therapeutic letters. It's not the enlightened adult version of Jeannie or the rational side of her that can see a higher perspective of the issue. If you've done a lot of work within a coaching or a therapeutic format, it might be obvious that in order to heal and move forward, one usually has to see how the wounded, not yet healed parts of us feel, perhaps the not so grown parts of us. We won't be able to make that much more progress if we only allow the PR correct version of ourselves to come forward. Most clients will need to be reminded of this. And this is also the case with the therapeutic letter. You want to give your client a clear verbal instruction to allow those not yet enlightened parts of themselves to respond. Also, even though it might feel like a straightforward assignment to write the therapeutic letter, especially with the opening statements that are part of your GTR therapeutic letter, it's still beneficial for the client to at least start the process with them. Many therapeutic and healing exercises are more powerful when there is a facilitator and when the client can really focus on what's going on for them emotionally rather than having to also guide themselves through the exercise. At the same time, there's also benefit in sitting down to writing these letters by themselves. What you can also expect is that there will be clients that will find it difficult to dig deep with the letters in your presence, but they will be able to go really deep by themselves. And vice versa. There will be clients who will have a very hard time accessing their thoughts and emotions and write the therapeutic letter by themselves. And they will need you to facilitate this exercise, perhaps even on more than one occasion. When it comes to the instructions given with the therapeutic letter writing assignment, it is important also to explain to the client that while writing the therapeutic letter, they are allowed to vent and blame and accuse, and that they don't have to consider the other side of the coin. But we also want to let them know that we will do this part later in the process. But for now, it's just about giving space to the anger and the pain and any kind of venting and blaming. This is all not just allowed, but it's wanted. This information is rather essential, especially for clients who have done healing work before, because it's a common belief that one should not blame and always understand the intention of the other person. Now, that's true, but of course, this is possible only at a later stage when the healing process is at a stage where they can actually do this. At this point, Jeannie's intentional venting is critical so that the anger can be felt and experienced, maybe for the first time ever. Here's a comment that one of our students shared. I recently had a practice client connect with a very empowered sense of anger that led her feeling focused and dignified. And it was a huge relief for her to feel her anger as a protective force that was like a guardian for her boundaries. At the same time, I can see we have more work to do and that there's grief to process, much of which I sense comes from a small wounded girl inside. The little child within us who is often wounded expresses anger like a hurt child does. It isn't often dignified, it's messier and can involve tantrums. This is the anger that gets wrapped up in grief with past traumas and needs to be expressed in a raw way in letters or other types of assignment to honor endings. This anger has its place too and needs to be honored and expressed in the same way in order for this part of ourselves to feel seen and to be able to move on. Now let's talk about Jeannie's relationship to the emotion of anger. It's not uncommon that trauma work requires us to help the client redefine their relationship to anger as an emotion. Jeannie's relationship to her anger has shifted since the first case study that she appeared in. Initially, anger was a foreign feeling that it was totally destabilizing and overwhelming for her to tap into. And I had to guide her and encourage her through the emotional release recipe to de escalate her. This was the very first case study called Jeannie Needs to Unfreeze. In fact, there was a little bit of an ab reaction happening as well. Now, in this session, Jeannie owns and taps into her anger quite quickly and expresses how angry she is that her friend, who is also a therapist, saw how badly she was suffering from depression but didn't intervene and didn't recommend support for her. Jeannie is able to articulate this in a grounded way and isn't pulled off base by it. Not only that, she acknowledges that she's angry about a lot of things and at many people. There are many who haven't been there to support her. She's angry at her boyfriend, and she's also angry at the cultural legacy where she was taught about putting on a show and carrying on. This redefining of the client's relationship to anger happens across several sessions most of the time. In this session, Jeannie makes an observant link between her tendency to dissolve into tears and her repressed anger. Since anger was an unacceptable emotion in her household growing up, fully feeling and expressing it wasn't an option. It was safer to get emotional release by crying instead. This also means, however, that Jeannie cannot fully access the power that empowered anger gives us. She remains in a victimized state instead and can't push herself out of it just yet. What do we notice about this client in this particular session? Compared to the very first case study with Jeannie, which was also her first GTR session, Jeannie Needs to Unfreeze, in this session she appears to have more life in her. Jeannie appeared pale and almost listless in the first case study and would break down emotionally quite often. She was completely overwhelmed. Here, Jeannie seems steadier and her face looks more vibrant. She has color in her skin tone and her complexion and her eyes are brighter. Noticing these changes in the client and evaluating their meaning and significance informs us about the best way to proceed with the client in any given session. Jeannie digs deep in writing her therapeutic letter. She is able to articulate the pain and the betrayal she feels from her friend Jeannie, who could see her suffering and understood her family dynamics, but whom Jeannie resents for not doing more to educate her and help her to get support. Jeannie tears up during this process. She shares an image of herself where she describes herself feeling like a little girl in a 40-year-old body. And if you look at how her body carries herself, it really does seem like a young girl who is hurt. Hurt because no one has stepped in to help her or save her from the family. Jeannie also realizes that she goes into tears when she feels happy and when she's having fun. She can't fully enjoy things because this makes her sad as well. As she describes this tendency, she literally looks like a scared, sad little girl. Now, just a slight follow up when it comes to Jeannie after this session. Not long after, Jeannie has made some incredible changes in her life. She went back to Mexico at some point. She took charge of her family affairs. She set up an Airbnb in a couple of their family properties. She also moved her mother to a family beach house and she made sure that she was on the right mental health medication. Her mother now takes antidepressants as well as antipsychotics. Jeannie also set things up so that her mother would be financially covered no matter what happens. At the same time, she pitched a business project that she was passionate about to an investor and got a yes. And last but not least, after so much agony, It looks like she's finally getting a divorce from her husband, setting him free. All right, let's now look at some challenges that tend to come up with this session. One of our students said, towards the end of this session, Jeannie shows a keen awareness of some of her tendencies, especially collapsing into tears when she feels anger or joy coming up. They are overwhelming for her. However, she displays the possible downside to having this kind of awareness as well. She begins to analyze how similar she is to a character in The Great Gatsby, how she has found that she hated that character, even though she is just like her. She begins to go into an academic like interpretation of the novel and the perspective of the characters. As she does this, she is visibly more activated emotionally. Her over rationalizing creates a spiral that feeds itself and gets overwhelming for her. And this is what Professor Isabella reminds her is similar to chewing endlessly without digesting. I can fall into similar patterns, and even when I'm not over rationalizing, I'm extremely curious and I love making connections between different things the same way Jeannie starts doing. A potential challenge for me would be to ensure that I don't feed the spiral and that I'm able to interrupt the cycle so that Jeannie doesn't get carried away with it. Let's talk about this a little bit. Rationalizing, of course, is a strategy that leads to disassociation. So we're not surprised to see it in Jeannie. In fact, whenever her emotions get to a certain point of intensity, she flips back to rationalizing. But with her, there's also the opposite tendency when she gets too numb. And that's where she can become a bit dramatic, as if this was an unconscious attempt to break that apathy and numbness just to feel alive. And this is, by the way, also common in people who've had trauma, especially complex trauma. They might try to get to that feeling of aliveness through risky behaviors. For example, through being highly promiscuous or taking drugs to change their state. Jeannie, for instance, had an affair behind her husband's back, and I do think that part of her was trying to feel more alive, to break through that numbness that can be devastating to the human psyche. Perhaps she was thinking that the numbness was caused by an unfulfilling, not so exciting marriage. But understanding that a big part of Jeannie's current challenges are the result of trauma, there's a high likelihood that the numbness was also a traumatic symptom to a large extent. Now, I also try to interject humor into the situation. Again, that was to break that rationalization spiral, if you will. There was one point when Jeannie was getting more emotionally heated, talking about how she falls apart and cries because she's afraid to have fun. And that's where I joked that this swinging back and forth is like being hormonal and it's like hitting puberty all over again. Jeannie laughs at this, and it did indeed interrupt that spiraling when this strategy was used. And lastly, sticking to homework assignments that are not overwhelming is key with clients like this. This was a client who was already very emotionally overwhelmed. This was even before she came to me. It's been a long term problem for her. And therefore, I made sure that I was taking things rather slowly with her. We had that intense session Jeannie needs to unfreeze. That was her first GTR session. But then in between, we had a session where she actually was given that warm breakfast assignment. And now we're doing the letter writing, but I'm not clearing any traumas. For clients who are emotionally overwhelmed, like Jeannie, especially in the earlier sessions, you really want to avoid doing too much traumatic memory clearing on their own. particularly with intense memories or memories with a common thread that will be big and daunting. In fact, you still give them the basic recipe and the emotional release recipe instructions, but I do like to emphasize that they don't have to tackle specific traumas from their past. For clients like these, it might be more beneficial to almost use these protocols just to sustain themselves in a better, more resourceful emotional state in between sessions. And then you focus on the clearing when you're with them in person. Another student mentioned that a potential challenge would be in realizing that there was more grief to process before Jeannie could move into the neutral zone. She said, at the beginning of the session, Jeannie was exhibiting some emotions of anger, and I felt that this was a more empowered anger, and I took it as great progress in Jeannie. As a result, I may have taken that as a sign that she was ready to move forward. Now, just to recap, the readiness to move into the neutral zone usually shows up as, for example, more energized state where the negative, usually less energetic emotional states such as sadness, apathy, or grief become more intertwined with the more energetic emotional states, both negative and positive, for example, with fear, which is energizing, but also excitement. Now, while Jeannie got more in touch with her anger, there was still so much sadness in her. When she disconnected from her anger for a moment, she fell right back into the less energized states of apathy and sadness. And there was no thrill, no excitement, no anticipation that normally comes with someone being ready to move into the neutral zone. In terms of closure, in order to move a client into the neutral zone, you want them to have closure. You want that ending stage to be complete. Now, Jeannie is nowhere near closure. In fact, that therapeutic letter is an ending stage. You can see that it's a little bit of a Pandora's box. It's there to help her access the sense of loss, but she's nowhere near having a closure when it comes to those losses. Right now, we're just helping Jeannie process her grief and that sense of loss. And this is something we normally do in the ending stage in order to help the client eventually reach closure. One last minor challenge. One of our students shared this about Jeannie has letters to write. She said, when Jeannie shared about how laughing made her sad, I don't know what I would have said to that, but perhaps nothing needed to be said. This was her experience and a symptom of all that she's been through. I don't think Professor Isabella offered any explanation either, so perhaps that is the answer on how to handle it right there. Now, as a solution, you could always ask her to tell you more about that. There's no harm in doing that. If you find this part of what she's saying to you to be important or significant. I guess in this particular case, Jeannie simply meant that she has become unused to laughing and to laughter. And it's that realization that made her sad. That's how I interpreted it in my head. And because I didn't find it significant to talk about this, I didn't comment on that. I just understood that, yes, this is part of her freeze response. It's been a long time since she hasn't laughed. It's something that she actually mentioned in her audio message after our first session. And the fact that she now realizes it and it feels sad, well, at least her emotions are waking up. When sadness comes to the surface, when grief comes to the surface, it's not a bad thing. It actually means that the person is waking up from the apathy, from the numbness. It's one tiny but significant step forward. Their emotions are coming back on board. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And in the meantime, I will be looking forward to connecting with you again in another answer key. Bye for now.